In the golden summer of 1916, when letters meant life itself and silence meant something far worse, Miss Lily Aston sat at a simple wooden table in her father's cottage and wrote to a stranger. The late afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the paper as her pen moved with careful determination. Outside, the village of Thornfield carried on as it always had, though the war had changed everything beneath the surface. Men had marched away with promises on their lips and hope in their eyes. Some had returned. Many had not. And some, like Lieutenant James Fletcher of the King's Regiment, existed in that terrible space between presence and absence, where hope and fear battled endlessly. Lily had never met Lieutenant Fletcher. His name had come to her through the church committee that organized letter writing to soldiers who received no correspondence from home. Orphaned, the vicar had explained quietly. No family remaining. The thought had pierced Lily's heart with unusual sharpness. She imagined him in muddy trenches, surrounded by men who read letters from mothers and sweethearts, while he sat alone with nothing but duty and danger. That image had compelled her to volunteer, to become the stranger who might bring small comfort to another stranger's solitude. Her first letter had been hesitant, filled with the ordinary details of village life. She wrote about the garden behind the cottage where roses bloomed despite her father's illness. About the way sunlight struck the church spire each morning. About books she had read and music she played on the old piano that had belonged to her mother. Nothing profound or particularly interesting, just the simple texture of daily existence offered to someone far from home. She signed it simply, "Yours in friendship, Miss Lily Aston." Then she folded the paper, sealed it carefully, and sent it to an address that seemed impossibly distant. France, the Western Front, a place of mud and blood that existed beyond her imagination. Days became weeks. Weeks stretched into months. No reply arrived. Lily continued writing anyway. Once each week without fail, she composed another letter to the silent soldier. She wrote about changing seasons, about her father's declining health and her determination to care for him, about small victories and quiet sorrows, about the way hope persisted even when reason suggested abandonment. She asked no questions that demanded answers, made no complaints about his silence. Instead, she offered her words as gifts, with no expectation of return, like dropping stones into a well so deep that no splash ever echoed back. The other women in the letter-writing committee eventually stopped asking whether she had received replies. Their pitying looks said enough. One by one, they suggested gently that perhaps her efforts were wasted on a soldier who clearly had no interest in correspondence. But Lily could not stop. Some instinct deeper than logic told her that her words mattered, that somewhere in the chaos and horror of war, Lieutenant James Fletcher received her letters and perhaps found small comfort in them, even if he never wrote back. She chose to believe this. The alternative, that her letters disappeared into void or reached a man already gone, was too terrible to consider. By the autumn of 1917, Lily had written 52 letters, one for every week across an entire year. Her father's condition had worsened, confining him to bed and requiring constant care. Money grew scarce as his ability to work as the village schoolmaster ended. Lily took in sewing and laundry to make ends meet, her hands growing red and rough from constant labor. Yet every Sunday afternoon, no matter how exhausted, she sat at the wooden table and wrote to the soldier who never replied. The village assumed she harbored romantic feelings for an imaginary hero. They whispered behind gloved hands about poor Lily Aston wasting her youth on a fantasy. At 23, she should be considering marriage to one of the few remaining local men. Instead, she devoted herself to a ghost in uniform. She heard these whispers and felt their judgment, but remained unmoved. Her letters to Lieutenant Fletcher had become something beyond romance or foolishness. They had become an act of faith, a refusal to accept that human connection could be completely severed by distance and silence. Then came the November morning that changed everything. Lily was hanging laundry in the small garden, her breath misting in the cold air, when she heard the gate creak open. She turned, expecting Mrs. Harris from next door, and instead found herself facing a stranger. A tall man in civilian clothes stood hesitantly at the edge of her garden path. His dark hair was neatly cut, his posture military despite the absence of uniform, but it was his eyes that captured her attention. Grey-blue and filled with an expression she could not immediately name, something like sorrow mixed with determination. "Miss Ashton," he said quietly. His voice was deep and careful, as though each word required consideration. "I am Captain Thomas Fletcher." The name struck her like a physical blow. Fletcher. She stared at him, her hands still gripping the wet sheet she had been hanging. Her heart began to pound with sudden, terrible certainty. "You are," she began, but her voice failed. "James's brother," he finished gently. "His elder brother." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Lily reached out blindly for the support of the clothesline. Captain Fletcher moved forward instinctively, but stopped himself, maintaining respectful distance. "Perhaps we might speak inside," he suggested. "What I have come to say requires privacy and time." Lily nodded numbly. She led him into the cottage's small parlour, where her father dozed in his chair by the fire. Captain Fletcher removed his hat and stood awkwardly in the centre of the modest room. His gaze moved around the space, taking in the worn furniture, the simple decorations, the care evident despite obvious poverty. Then his attention fixed on something across the room, and his expression shifted to something like wonder. There on the mantel stood a small frame containing a studio photograph. A young man in lieutenant's uniform stared seriously at the camera. Dark hair, strong features, eyes that held both determination and gentleness. Lily had obtained the photograph months ago through the regimental headquarters, a small attempt to give face to the stranger she wrote to weekly. Captain Fletcher moved toward it slowly, as though drawn by invisible threads. "That is James," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My brother." Lily found her voice at last. "Please sit down, Captain Fletcher. I shall make tea." The familiar ritual of hospitality gave her shaking hands purpose. As she moved about the tiny kitchen, heating water and preparing the tea tray, her mind raced through terrible possibilities. If James's brother had come in person to this remote village, the news could only be one thing. The kind of news that arrived in telegrams and left families forever broken. But when she returned with the tea, Captain Fletcher's expression held something more complex than simple grief. He accepted the cup with formal gratitude, but did not immediately drink. Instead, he reached into the leather satchel he carried and withdrew a bundle wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. His hands, she noticed, trembled slightly as he placed it on the small table between them. "Miss Ashton," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I have travelled from London specifically to find you, to deliver these and to offer explanations that are long overdue." Lily stared at the bundle. Something in its shape and size made her breath catch. "Letters," she whispered. "Those are letters." Thomas Fletcher nodded slowly. 52 letters to be precise. "Every word you wrote to my brother across the past year and 4 months. Every kindness you offered to a stranger who you believed never replied." Lily's hands moved to her throat. "He received them. All of them." "Yes," Thomas said softly. "He received every single letter you sent. He carried them with him constantly, read them until the paper wore thin, treasured them as the most precious things he possessed." "Then why?" Lily could not finish the question. Pain and confusion warred in her chest. Why did he never write back? Thomas set down his untouched tea and leaned forward, his gaze direct and earnest. That, Miss Ashton, is a story I must tell you completely. A story of my brother's courage, his wounds and his silence, and why I have come to you now carrying not his letters, but his heart. The fire crackled in the grate. Lily's father stirred slightly, but did not wake. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, and Captain Thomas Fletcher began to speak, his words painting a picture of war and sacrifice that would forever change everything. Lily understood about silence and love, and the words that bridge impossible distances. James Fletcher, Thomas explained, his voice low and measured, was one of the finest men I have ever known. Not because he sought glory or distinction, but because he possessed uncommon gentleness in a world that valued hardness. He had been a school teacher before the war. Much like your father, his students adored him. He had a gift for making even the most difficult child feel seen and valued. Thomas paused, his gaze distant as though seeing his brother in memory. When war was declared, James felt it his duty to serve, not from nationalism or adventure, but from that same protective instinct that made him such a good teacher. He believed he could shield others, help bring them home safely. Lily listened without interruption, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Thomas continued. James and I were very different. I was the elder by 3 years, more practical and less idealistic. I joined the army as a career long before the war began. James was the gentle one, the one who saw beauty in small things and believed in the fundamental goodness of people. The trenches broke many men of such nature, but James endured somehow without losing that essential kindness. He paused to collect himself. In the spring of 1916, James was wounded during a German offensive. Shrapnel from an artillery shell struck him across the right side of his body. He survived, but the damage was severe. His right arm and hand were badly injured. After months of recovery, he regained partial use, but his hand remained weak and unsteady. Fine motor control, the doctor said, would never fully return. Thomas's jaw tightened with the memory. For most men that would have been frustrating. For James it was devastating, because it meant he could no longer write clearly. Lily's breath caught as understanding began to dawn. He could not hold a pen steadily. Thomas confirmed quietly. His letters came out shaky and nearly illegible. He tried countless times to reply to your correspondence. I saw him attempt it repeatedly, but every effort left him frustrated and ashamed. He didn't want you to receive letters that looked like they had been written by a child or an invalid. He felt it would dishonor the beautiful words you sent him. Tears stung Lily's eyes. So he chose silence rather than send imperfect replies. Not silence by choice. Thomas corrected gently. Silence by necessity that tormented him constantly. He spoke of you often to me in his letters. The kind Miss Ashton, who wrote so faithfully despite receiving nothing in return. He called you his light in darkness, his reminder that gentleness still existed in the world. He memorized passages from your letters and would recite them in the trenches to comfort other men who were frightened or homesick. Thomas reached for the bundle of letters and carefully untied the string. The brown paper fell away to reveal the stack of envelopes. All 52 of them worn at the edges from constant handling and rereading. He kept them in a waterproof pouch next to his heart, Thomas said, running his fingers over the aged paper. Other men carried photographs or Bibles or good luck charms. James carried your words. Why did he not explain through another means? Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He could have dictated a letter to someone else. He could have sent word through official channels. I suggested exactly that many times, Thomas replied. But James refused. He felt it would be dishonest to have another person write words that should come from his own hand. He believed you deserved authenticity, not proxy expressions written by strangers. He was perhaps too principled for his own good, or perhaps too proud to admit his limitation. Lily brushed tears from her cheeks with trembling fingers. So he simply read my letters and said nothing. He read them and treasured them and lived by them. Thomas corrected softly. In his final letter to me before he paused, steadying himself before the end, he wrote extensively about you. He asked me to find you if anything happened to him, to explain his silence and to thank you for keeping him human when everything around him was designed to make men into weapons. The word final hung in the air like a tolling bell. Lily's hands tightened in her lap until her knuckles turned white. He is gone then, she stated rather than asked. The terrible confirmation she had expected from the moment Thomas Fletcher appeared at her gate. Yes, Thomas said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. 2 weeks ago, not in battle, but from the injuries that never fully healed. An infection that his weakened body could not fight. He died in a field hospital with your latest letter in his hand. Lily closed her eyes against the wave of grief that crashed over her. She had written to a ghost for months without knowing it. No, Thomas said, as though reading her thoughts. You wrote to a living man who needed those words more than breath itself, who survived as long as he did in part because your letters gave him reason to endure. That is not nothing, Miss Ashton. That is everything. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling fire and the sound of Lily's quiet weeping. Thomas sat motionless, allowing her grief its necessary expression. When she finally raised her head, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. Why did you come all this way to tell me this? A telegram or letter would have sufficed. Because James asked me to, Thomas replied simply. But also because I needed to see with my own eyes the woman whose compassion could reach across impossible distance to touch my brother's heart. And because he hesitated, meeting her gaze directly, I needed to thank you myself for giving him something I could not. Peace in the midst of hell. Lily studied him properly for the first time, saw the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of his own battles fought and witnessed, the way he held himself with military precision that seemed to cost him effort, the grief he carried with disciplined containment. You loved him very much, she observed quietly. He was my brother, and my better self, Thomas said simply. The world is darker without him in it. They sat together in the small parlor as the afternoon light faded to dusk. Thomas told her stories of James, his childhood dreams of traveling to see the great museums of Europe, his habit of rescuing injured animals and nursing them back to health, the way he could recite poetry from memory and did so to calm frightened new recruits, the time he had given his own rations to a starving French child, despite being hungry himself. Each story painted a picture of the man Lily had written to, but never met. A man of quiet courage and uncommon kindness who had lived and died largely unnoticed by history, but who had touched those around him with gentle grace. Your letters were not wasted, Miss Ashton, Thomas said, as darkness gathered in the corners of the room. They sustained him, reminded him what he was fighting to protect. Every word mattered more than you can possibly know. Lily touched the bundle of letters that now rested on the table between them. May I? She asked, gesturing toward them. Of course, Thomas said. They were written by you. They belong to you. With reverent care, Lily picked up the first envelope. Her handwriting looked back at her, the address carefully written in her best script. The paper was stained and worn, the envelope seal long since broken. She withdrew the letter and unfolded it. The creases were deep from countless readings. In the margins, in a shaky, barely legible script, were notes written in pencil, brief words in James's damaged hand. Beautiful? This exactly. Yes. DQ, small affirmations that her words had been received and cherished. Lily pressed the letter to her heart as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Thomas watched her with an expression of profound sorrow and equally profound respect. After a long moment, he spoke again. "There is something else, Miss Ashton. Something I must ask you." Lily looked up, waiting. Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather-bound journal. This was James's diary, he explained. He kept it throughout his service. Most entries are brief, observations about weather or duties or daily routines. But there are longer passages throughout. Many of them are about you, about what your letters meant to him, about the woman he came to care for despite never meeting her. He held the journal carefully, as though it were fragile as butterfly wings. In the final entries, written in the weeks before his death, James wrote something I believe you should see. With your permission, I would like to read a portion to you. Lily nodded, unable to speak. Thomas opened the journal to a marked page and began to read. His voice was steady but emotional. September 8th, 1917. Another letter arrived from Miss Ashton today, the 47th by my count, nearly a year of faithful correspondence to a stranger who cannot reply. I have tried again to write back. My hand will not cooperate. The words come out twisted and illegible like the thoughts of a madman. I tore up 3 attempts before accepting defeat once more. Thomas paused, then continued. I find myself in an impossible situation. How does one confess feeling for someone one has never met? Yet I cannot deny what has grown in my heart across these months of reading her words. Miss Ashton writes of roses and sunlight, and her father's illness with such grace and honesty. She asks nothing of me, expects nothing, simply gives of herself week after week, with no expectation of return. This is love in its purest form, not the romance of novels, but the steady, faithful kindness that asks nothing and gives everything. Thomas's voice grew thicker. I do not know if I will survive this war. The odds grow longer with each passing day. But if I do not, I hope Thomas will honor my request to find Miss Ashton and explain my silence, to tell her that her letters saved me in ways I cannot express. But if circumstances were different, if I could write or return home or live a normal life, I would go to her. I would kneel before her and thank her and ask if perhaps the friendship born through letters might become something more. But that is fantasy. This is reality, and in this reality I can only read her words and treasure them and die grateful that such goodness existed in my life, even from afar. Thomas closed the journal carefully. The room was nearly dark now, lit only by the fire's glow. Lily sat motionless, tears streaming down her face in silver tracks. My brother died loving you, Miss Ashton, Thomas said quietly. A woman he never met, but knew perhaps better than most men know their wives. He died with your name on his lips and your letter in his hand. I thought you should know that. Thought you deserved to understand what your kindness accomplished. The weight of this revelation settled over Lily like a heavy cloak. She had written to ease a soldier's loneliness. Instead, she had somehow kindled love in the heart of a dying man. The knowledge was both beautiful and devastating in equal measure. I did not know, she whispered. I never imagined. How could you? Thomas replied gently. You were simply being who you are, kind and faithful and good. Those qualities do not require imagination. They simply exist and touch those fortunate enough to encounter them. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks upward. Lily's father stirred and woke, blinking in confusion at the strange man in their parlor. Lily rose to attend him, grateful for a moment to compose herself. As she helped her father take water and resettled him in his chair, she felt Thomas's gaze upon her. When she returned to her seat, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You care for your father alone," he observed, without complaint or assistance. A statement, not a question. "I am all he has," Lily replied simply, "and he is all I have. Family cares for family." Thomas nodded slowly. James would have admired that. He believed devotion to family was among the highest virtues. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Thomas spoke again. "Miss Ashton, I know this is neither the time nor place for such discussion, but there are practical matters I must address before I return to London." "Practical matters?" Lily repeated, confused. Thomas leaned forward, his expression earnest. "James left instructions in his will. Small though his savings were, he directed that they be given to you, to help care for your father, and ensure you would not suffer hardship." Lily's eyes widened in shock. "I cannot accept such a thing," she protested. "I did not write to him expecting any kind of payment or reward." "Of course you did not," Thomas agreed. "That is precisely why James wanted you to have it. Please do not refuse this final wish of a man who had so little power to affect anything in his final days." The logic was irrefutable, but the idea still troubled Lily deeply. "It feels wrong to profit from his death." "You would not profit," Thomas corrected gently. "You would accept a gift freely given by someone who cared for you. There is no shame in that." Lily looked at her father dozing by the fire, thought of the mounting debts and her worn hands and the constant worry of how they would manage, thought of James Fletcher, who had somehow cared enough about a stranger to think of her welfare even as he faced death. "Very well," she said quietly. "I accept with gratitude and the promise that his gift will be used well and remembered always." Thomas smiled for the first time since his arrival, a brief expression that transformed his stern features into something warmer. "Good," he said. "I shall make the necessary arrangements. The funds will be transferred to your account within a fortnight." Lily thanked him, but her mind was already moving beyond practical concerns. "Tell me more about him," she requested. "Everything you can remember. I wrote to him for over a year, but I feel I barely knew him. I would like to know who he truly was." So Thomas talked. As full darkness settled outside and the fire burned low, he shared memories of his younger brother. He spoke of James's dreams and fears, his humor and his heartbreaks, the way he had once spent an entire week's wages buying books for his poorest students, how he had taught himself to play guitar and would perform silly songs to make children laugh, the time he had jumped into a freezing river to save a drowning dog despite not being a strong swimmer himself. Each story revealed layers of character that deepened Lily's understanding and intensified her grief for the man she would never meet. When the mantel clock struck 9, Thomas finally rose to leave. "I have taken too much of your time," he said, though the warmth in his voice suggested the evening had been important to him as well. "Thank you for receiving me, and for listening, for honoring James's memory with your tears." Lily stood as well, suddenly reluctant to see him go. "Captain Fletcher," she hesitated. "Will you? That is, might I ask if you plan to return to Thornfield, or is this farewell?" Thomas studied her face in the firelight. His expression shifted through several emotions before settling into quiet resolve. "I had not planned to return," he admitted, "but I find myself reluctant to maintain only written correspondence after meeting you. If it would not be an imposition, might I visit again, to ensure you are managing well, and to perhaps share more stories of James?" Lily felt warmth spread through her chest. "I would like that very much. Please do come again, as often as you wish." Thomas bowed formally. Then I shall return next month, if that is agreeable. Lily walked him to the door, where he retrieved his hat and coat. As he prepared to step into the cold November night, he turned back once more. "Miss Ashton," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected intensity. "What you gave my brother through your letters, the faithfulness and kindness without expectation of return, that is a rare and precious thing. Do not let anyone convince you it was foolish or wasted. It was neither. It was simply love in one of its truest forms." Before Lily could respond, he was gone. She stood in the doorway, watching his figure disappear down the dark lane until the night swallowed him completely. Then she closed the door and returned to the parlor, where the bundle of her own letters waited. She spent the next hours reading them one by one, seeing her words through new eyes, noticing James's penciled notes in the margins. Each small annotation was a window into his thoughts. Beside a passage about roses he had written, "My mother grew these," next to her description of caring for her father, true nobility, on a page where she had written about hope persisting despite difficulty, "This is why I continue." By the time she finished reading all 52 letters, dawn was breaking beyond the windows. Lily sat surrounded by paper and memory, her heart full of grief and something else she could not quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or purpose. The knowledge that her words had mattered, that her faithfulness had been seen and valued, even if never acknowledged in the way she had expected. She carefully gathered the letters and tied them with fresh ribbon. These would be kept and treasured. Evidence that love could bridge impossible distance, that words written in loneliness could bring comfort to someone, even more alone, that sometimes the most profound connections form between strangers who never meet but know each other's hearts better than those who see each other daily. The weeks that followed brought gradual adjustment. The funds from James's estate arrived as promised, lifting the immediate burden of poverty from Lily's shoulders. She used the money carefully, paying debts, securing proper medical care for her father, making necessary repairs to their small cottage. But she also donated a portion to the church's Soldier Relief Fund, knowing James would have approved. True to his word, Captain Thomas Fletcher returned to Thornfield exactly 1 month after his first visit. He arrived on a cold December afternoon carrying a small wrapped package. "For you," he said as Lily welcomed him inside. "Something of James's I thought you should have." Lily unwrapped the package carefully to discover a leather-bound book. She opened it to find poetry, the pages worn from frequent reading. This was his favorite, Thomas explained. He carried it through 2 years of war. "I know he would want you to have it now." Lily pressed the book to her heart, overwhelmed by the intimacy of the gift. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than I can say." Thomas stayed for tea and conversation. Unlike his first visit, dominated by grief and heavy revelation, this time their talk was lighter. He told funny stories about James's childhood misadventures. She shared memories of her own youth and her mother, who had died when she was young. They discovered shared love of music and literature. Before either realized it, 3 hours had passed and dusk was gathering outside. "I should go," Thomas said, though he seemed reluctant. "But might I return again?" "Perhaps after the holidays." "Please do," Lily replied. "Your visits bring comfort and," she hesitated, "friendship." "I hope." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. "Friendship," he repeated softly. "Yes, I would very much like that, Miss Ashton. Friendship with you would honor my brother's memory and," he paused, "be valuable in its own right." Throughout the winter, Thomas visited Thornfield once each month. Sometimes he stayed for an afternoon, sometimes for several days, taking rooms at the village inn and spending his time helping Lily with heavy work around the cottage that she could not manage alone. He repaired the sagging porch rail, chopped wood for the winter, helped reorganize her father's library. These practical acts of service felt like continuation of his brother's legacy of quiet kindness. But they also became something more. Thomas Fletcher was not his brother. Where James had been gentle and idealistic, Thomas was practical and grounded. Where James had been a dreamer, Thomas was a man of action. Yet beneath his military bearing and stern exterior, Lily discovered a man of deep feeling and unexpected tenderness. He simply expressed these qualities differently than his brother had. By spring, their relationship had evolved beyond shared grief into genuine connection. Thomas spoke of his own war experiences with Lily in a way he had never shared with anyone else. The guilt he carried over surviving when so many, including James, had not. The nightmares that still woke him. The struggle to find purpose in peacetime. Lily listened without judgment, offering the same faithful compassion she had once given to James through letters. She found herself writing less in her journal and talking more with Thomas during his visits. Their conversations ranged from profound to playful. They debated literature and politics, shared recipes and gardening tips, laughed over silly jokes, and sat in comfortable silence when words were unnecessary. One April evening, as they sat together in the garden, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Thomas spoke carefully. "Miss Ashton, Lily." He corrected himself, using her first name for the first time. "There is something I must say, something that has been growing in my heart these past months." Lily's breath caught, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I came here last November to honor my brother's memory, to deliver his letters and explain his silence. But in doing so, I found something unexpected." He turned to face her directly. "I found you. Not James's imagined ideal, but the real woman, complex and kind and strong in ways I never anticipated. And I find myself," he hesitated, "falling in love with you." Lily felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thomas, she began, but he gently interrupted. "Please let me finish," he requested. "I know this is complicated, that my brother loved you first, that perhaps your feelings for him, incomplete as that relationship was, prevent you from considering me in such a light. But I cannot continue visiting you and pretending friendship is all I feel. It would be dishonest, and you deserve honesty above all things." He reached across the space between them and carefully took her hand. "If you cannot return my feelings, I will understand. I will remove myself from your life, though it will pain me greatly. But if there is any possibility that you might someday care for me as more than your lost soldier's brother, then I ask permission to court you properly, to see if what I believe is growing between us has genuine foundation." Lily looked down at their joined hands. Thomas's palm was calloused from work and marked with scars from war. It was real and present in a way James's had never been. She thought of the year she had spent writing to a silent soldier, of the love that had grown in her heart for a man she never met, of the grief she had felt, learning he was gone. But she also thought of these past months, with Thomas, the laughter and conversations and growing comfort in his presence, the way her heart lifted when she heard his approaching footsteps, the way his visits had become the center around which her weeks revolved. "I loved James," she said slowly, thinking through each word. "Or perhaps I loved the idea of James, the gentle soul who read my words and treasured them. But you are right, that relationship was incomplete, founded on imagination and distance." Thomas's expression was carefully neutral, but she felt the tension in his hand. "What I feel for you," she continued, "is different. You are real, present. I know your faults as well as your virtues, And still, or perhaps because of that, I find myself," she paused, "falling in love with you too." The transformation in Thomas's face was immediate and profound. Relief and joy broke through his careful control. "Truly," he asked, his voice rough with emotion, "you do not feel this is a betrayal of James's memory?" Lily shook her head, squeezing his hand. "I think James would be glad. He loved us both. He wanted my happiness, and I believe bringing us together was perhaps his final gift. We found each other through his letters. That is not betrayal. That is grace." Thomas raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture of reverence and promise. Then, "Lily Aston, will you allow me to court you properly? To see if this love might lead where I hope it will?" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Thomas, I will." The seasons turned. Summer brought warmth to Thornfield, and deepening love between Lily and Thomas. He visited every other week now, and they walked together through countryside that seemed more beautiful because it was shared. They read poetry aloud. He taught her to fish in the stream behind the cottage. She taught him to bake the honey cakes her mother had once made. They spoke often of James, keeping his memory alive between them, not as grief but as gratitude for the connection he had forged. In August, Lily's father passed peacefully in his sleep. Thomas arrived within a day of receiving her telegram and stayed through the funeral and the difficult weeks that followed. His steadfast presence during her mourning proved to Lily what she had already suspected. This was a man she could trust with her heart and life. He did not offer empty platitudes or try to rush her grief. He simply stayed, did what needed doing, held her when she wept, and reminded her through action more than words that she was not alone. On a September evening, exactly 2 years after James had died, Thomas and Lily returned to the garden where he had first confessed his feelings. The roses bloomed in defiance of approaching autumn. The sky held that particular golden quality of late summer light. Thomas took both of Lily's hands in his and knelt before her on the soft grass. "Lily Aston," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I kneel before you, not as my brother's replacement, but as a man who loves you for exactly who you are. You are kind and faithful and strong. You honor memory while embracing future, and I want to spend whatever years remain to me learning all the depths of your heart that I have only begun to discover." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring. "It had belonged to our mother," he explained. "James never had chance to offer it to anyone, but I believe he would want you to have it now. Will you marry me, Lily? Will you allow me to spend my life trying to be worthy of the love you give so freely?" Tears streamed down Lily's face, but she was smiling as she answered, "Yes, Thomas, yes. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to gather her into his arms. They stood together in the fading light, two people who had found each other through letters and loss and love that transcended both. The wedding took place in November in the small village church. It was a quiet affair attended by friends and neighbors who had watched Lily's faithful letter writing and who now witnessed this unexpected happy ending. As Lily walked down the aisle toward Thomas, she carried a small bouquet of late autumn roses tied with ribbon. Hidden within the bouquet, visible only to her, was a single folded letter. The first one she had written to Lieutenant James Fletcher 2 years before. She had not told Thomas she would carry it. But somehow, as they exchanged vows and rings before the flower-decked altar, she knew he understood. They were not erasing James, they were honoring him. The love she had offered him had not disappeared into void. It had transformed and grown and ultimately brought her to this moment. Standing beside a man who had taught her that love takes many forms, that faithfulness is never wasted. that words written in hope can bridge impossible distance and bring unexpected grace. After the ceremony, as they emerged from the church into pale November sunlight, Thomas turned to his new wife and spoke quietly, so only she could hear. "Thank you, Lily Fletcher, for writing to a soldier who could not reply, for bringing my brother comfort in his darkest hours, and for having courage to love me despite the complicated path that brought us here." Lily reached up to touch his face gently. "We found each other because of those letters, Thomas, not despite them. That is the gift James gave us both." Thomas kissed her softly, then offered his arm. Together they walked through the village toward their future. The townspeople smiled and offered congratulations. Someone threw rice that caught in Lily's hair and made her laugh. The November wind carried the scent of wood smoke and approaching winter. That evening, in their small cottage now belonging to them both, Lily sat at the familiar wooden table where she had once written 52 letters to a silent soldier. Thomas stood behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. Before them lay the bundle of letters, James's diary, and the leather-bound poetry book, tangible evidence of love's mysterious paths. "Shall we put them away?" Thomas asked quietly. "Save them for when we have children to tell this story to." Lily covered his hand with hers. "Yes," she agreed, "but first, let me write one more." She withdrew fresh paper and her pen. Thomas watched as she began to write. Not a letter to James, for he was beyond such correspondence now, but a letter to herself. A record of this moment, and what it meant. She wrote about faith and hope and love that persists despite silence, about loss that transforms into unexpected joy, about letters that change lives, and brothers who share more than blood. She wrote until the page was full, then she signed it simply, "Yours in love and gratitude, Lily Fletcher." She folded the letter carefully and placed it with all the others. Then Thomas helped her wrap the entire collection in clean cloth and tie it with the same ribbon that had bound her wedding bouquet. They placed the bundle in a wooden box along with James's diary and book. Someday, their children would ask about the uncle they never met, and Lily would show them these letters and tell them the story of how love can travel through darkness and distance, how faithfulness matters even when it seems to disappear into silence, how sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. For now, the box was closed and set carefully on a high shelf. The letters had served their purpose, brought comfort to a dying soldier, forged connection between strangers, built a bridge that carried two grieving people toward healing and love. Thomas took Lily's hand and led her to the fireside where two chairs waited side by side. They sat together in comfortable silence as the fire crackled and the November night deepened beyond the windows. No words were needed now. They had said everything that mattered in 52 letters and countless conversations since. But in her heart, Lily whispered a final message to the soldier who would never reply. "Thank you, James, for reading my words, for treasuring them, for bringing your brother into my life. I will love him faithfully all our days. I will honor your memory, and I will never forget that you taught me the most important lesson, that kindness offered freely is never wasted, that love takes many forms, and that sometimes the most profound connections begin with a stranger's name and a single act of faith." The fire burned low. Outside, stars emerged in the clear, cold sky. And in the small cottage in Thornfield Village, two people who had found each other through letters sat together in peace. The silence between them was no longer empty, but full of shared history and present love and future hope. The soldier who never replied had given his final gift. Not words on paper, but the lasting legacy of bringing two hearts together through the courage of his faithful correspondent and the devotion of his loving brother. Some stories end with grand gestures and dramatic declarations. This one ends more quietly, with two people sitting by a fire, with letters safely stored, with gratitude for what was lost and joy for what was found, with the understanding that love's paths are rarely straight, but always meaningful when traveled with faith. Lily Aston had written to a soldier seeking to ease his loneliness. She had received no reply, yet her words had mattered more than she ever imagined. They had comforted a dying man, brought his brother to her door, and ultimately led her to a love she never anticipated, but which felt somehow inevitable, as though 52 letters had been writing this ending all along. In the morning they would wake to their first day as husband and wife. There would be ordinary tasks and simple pleasures, meals to cook and work to do, and moments of laughter and quiet companionship. But tonight, this final night of their wedding day, they simply sat together, two people bound by rings and vows and shared history. Two people who understood that the most important words are not always the ones that receive replies. Sometimes they are the ones that echo silently in grateful hearts and return to us transformed. Lily rested her head against Thomas's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her and pressed a kiss to her temple, and somewhere beyond time and space, perhaps a young lieutenant who had once carried letters next to his heart, smiled at the peace his silence had ultimately created. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of completion. The quiet that comes when words have accomplished their purpose and love has found its way home at last. Did this story of faithful letters and unexpected love move your heart? Subscribe now to receive more captivating historical romance tales delivered directly to you each week. Your subscription ensures you never miss another story of courage, devotion, and love that transcends distance. Comment below with your thoughts on Lily and Thomas's journey. Were you touched by her year of faithful letter writing? By James's silent devotion? By the unexpected love that bloomed from tragedy? Share your favorite moment and connect with other readers who believe in the power of words and the mysterious paths of true love. Like and share this video with someone who still believes that kindness is never wasted and love finds a way even through the darkest circumstances. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories of hope and healing to life. Stay until the end, and another heartfelt tale of devotion and courage will appear on your screen next.